Most performers early in their careers remember the night the audience didn't show up, or left early, or simply didn't listen. Edith Piaf remembered a night like that too, but not for the reason most people would expect. The story she told, in the rare moments she told it at all, was not a story about humiliation, or about the indifference of early audiences, or about the particular loneliness of performing in rooms that have decided, halfway through, that they would rather be somewhere else. All of those things were present, and she did not pretend they were not. But the story she returned to, when she returned to it, was about something else, about a single person who had stayed when everyone else had gone, and about what that person had done with the silence that opened up between them. To understand what kind of room she was in that night, and what leaving it early would have meant, you have to understand what the Paris cabaret circuit looked like for a young, unknown singer in those years, and how different it was from everything that came afterward. The cabarets where Edith Piaf first performed were not the kind of venues that recorded their programs or kept careful records of their bills. They were working establishments, rooms attached to restaurants, basement clubs, places that ran entertainment in the evenings because entertainment kept people at their tables, and at their tables they ordered more drinks. The performers who appeared in them were not, for the most part, the reason people came. They were part of the atmosphere, the background music of an evening that was primarily about other things. A singer who held the room's attention for a few minutes had done well. A singer who lost the room's attention and kept going anyway was simply an inconvenience and would probably not be booked again. This was the world Edith Piaf moved through in her earliest years as a professional performer, a world that had its own rules, its own indifference, and its own way of communicating to a performer exactly where they stood. She had come to it from the streets, from the courtyards where she had sung for coins, and the transition from the courtyard to the cabaret was not as large as it might have seemed from the outside. In both cases, the audience had not specifically come to hear her. In both cases, she had to earn whatever attention she received, with no guarantee that she would receive any at all. The geography of that world mattered. The cabarets were not spread evenly across Paris. They clustered along certain streets, in certain neighborhoods, Pigalle and Montmartre, Belleville, the narrow passages behind the larger music halls, and within those clusters they formed their own informal hierarchy. There were rooms that could launch a career, and rooms that simply kept a performer employed between launches. There were nights when agents walked through, and nights when no one important was in the house at all. A young singer moving through this circuit learned quickly to read a room before taking the stage, to assess what kind of night it was, who was in the seats, and what level of attention the evening was likely to produce. Edith Piaf had been reading rooms like this for years before she set foot inside a proper cabaret. The streets had taught her everything the streets could teach. What they had not taught her was how to be chosen. On this particular night, early in this period of her career, she was performing in a small cabaret, a room of perhaps 40 or 50 seats, most of them filled when she took the stage. The evening's crowd, a mixture of the regulars who came to this place out of habit and the occasional newcomers who had wandered in from the street. The room was not hostile. Rooms in those establishments rarely were, in the open way that audiences could be hostile in larger venues, where the energy of a crowd's displeasure could become something collective and loud. This room was simply occupied with itself, with its conversations, its drinks, its specific preoccupations of an ordinary weeknight in Paris, none of which had much to do with the young woman who had just walked onto the small raised platform at the front of the room and positioned herself behind the microphone. She began, and the room continued being the room. This was not a failure in any dramatic sense. It was simply the condition she had been given, and it was not unfamiliar. She had performed in rooms like this before, had learned the particular discipline of singing into noise and inattention, and treating it as though it were something more than it was, giving the performance she would have given if every face in the room had been turned toward her and every conversation had stopped. Sometimes this discipline produced results. Sometimes it did not. The room would do what the room was going to do, and she had learned, earlier than most, not to stake everything on its response. What she had not expected, and what made this particular night different from the ordinary indifference of ordinary rooms, was when the people started leaving. It did not happen all at once. It was, instead, the particular discouraging rhythm of an audience that has somewhere else to be. One couple gathering their coats, then another, then a small group near the back who had finished their drinks and seen no reason to order more. The room, which had been full when she began, was becoming noticeably less full. Not because anything had gone wrong, not because she had given them any specific reason to leave, but simply because it was getting late and the evening had run its course for them, and the person standing at the front of the room was not a reason to stay. This was the choice point of the evening, though calling it a choice may overstate how much control she felt she had over it. She was perhaps 3 songs into her set. The room was half empty and still emptying. The polite thing, the practical thing, the thing that would have been easiest for everyone involved would have been to find a place to stop, to end the set a few songs early, to step back from the microphone, to let the evening wind down the way evenings wound down, when the audience had already made its decision. She did not stop. What she did instead, the act of continuing into a room that had plainly decided it was finished with her, was something she could not have fully explained at the time, and did not try to. The songs she had planned to sing were the songs she had come to that stage to sing. They were not long. They did not ask much from an audience in terms of time. What they asked was attention, the same attention they would have asked from a full room. And the fact that the room was no longer full did not change what the songs required. This was not, by any account she later gave, a dramatic decision. It was not an act of defiance, or a declaration, or a moment in which she told herself something meaningful about who she was or what she was going to become. It was something quieter and, in its own way, more revealing. She simply could not make herself stop while there was still someone in the room. Not because stopping would have been a failure. She had been in situations that looked much more like failure than this one, and had survived them with less trouble than she would have expected. But because stopping felt, in that specific moment, like a different kind of wrong. Like a sentence left unfinished. Like a door left open in weather. By the time she reached the end of that song, the room had emptied to 1. A single person remained, seated, not near the front, not making any visible effort to claim the performance for themselves. Simply there, in the way that people are simply there when they have no particular reason to leave and no particular reason to stay, but have found themselves, through the ordinary drift of an evening, on one side of that equation rather than the other. Edith Piaf looked at that person and finished the set. there was a particular quality to performing in an almost empty room that a full room could not produce, and that she had not expected to notice in that moment. In a full room, the sound came back. The voice moved out, and the room answered it, with attention, with breath, with the small shifts of a crowd responding to what it was hearing. In a room with one person, the voice moved out, and nothing came back except the room itself, the walls, the particular quality of silence that a space holds when it has been emptied of almost everything it was built to contain. It was not a comfortable silence, but it was honest in the way that the performances she had been giving into noise and inattention were not quite honest, because honesty in a performance requires a real encounter, and a real encounter requires that someone is there. That person was there. Not the truncated version of the set, not a polite single song that acknowledged the circumstances and retreated from them with dignity and tact. The full set, or close enough to it that the difference did not matter, the songs she had planned to sing, in something close to the order she had planned to sing them, given to a room that contained one person and no one else. The accounts of what passed between her and that remaining person at the end of the evening are, like so many accounts from those early years, incomplete and second-hand, filtered through her own later tellings of it, and those tellings were themselves filtered through time and whatever she chose to include or leave out. What she said about it, in the versions that survived, was that the person had waited for her to finish and had then said something. Not much. A few words, the specific content of which changed slightly with each telling, the way specific content tends to change in stories that are told from memory rather than from notes. But the quality of what had been said remained consistent across all the versions. It had been genuine, and it had been said to her specifically, not to the performance in general, not to some idea of what she might become, but to what she had actually done in a room that was almost entirely empty, with no audience to perform for and no practical reason to continue. In later years, when interviewers asked Edith Piaf about the early period of her career, the small rooms, the inattentive audiences, the years before anything she did was reviewed or recorded or treated as significant, she tended to answer in ways that were truthful about the difficulty, without being particularly interested in the difficulty for its own sake. She had been through harder things than empty rooms, and she did not need the early struggle to justify the later success the way some performers seem to need it. But she returned to this night, or to nights shaped like this one, with a kind of particularity that suggested it had left something in her that other early experiences had not. Not because it had been the worst night, or the most humiliating, or the most discouraging. It had not been any of those things. It had been, in most respects, simply an unremarkable evening in an unremarkable place, the kind of night that produced no reviews, no consequences, no visible effect on anything that came afterward. What it had produced instead was something that did not show up in any record, the specific knowledge, acquired in real time rather than in theory, of what it felt like to keep singing when there was almost no reason to, and to find that the singing was still worth doing. Not worth doing in some large, abstract sense, not as a statement about perseverance, or as a lesson about the nature of a career, or as evidence of anything that could be pointed to and named. Worth doing in the most immediate and specific sense, because the person who had stayed deserved to hear the rest of the song, and because the song itself, it turned out, did not require an audience of hundreds to be true. This is what she remembered, in the end, about the night the audience left. Not the leaving, not the emptiness or the awkwardness, or the particular difficulty of performing into a room that is actively becoming a different kind of room while you are still standing in it. She remembered the one person who stayed and what it had felt like to sing the rest of the set to them, and the way the room had seemed, in those last few songs, to be exactly the right size for what was happening inside it. There is a kind of performer for whom the size of the audience is a measure of the performance's worth, who feels, in a nearly empty room, that whatever they are doing has failed before they have finished doing it, and whose voice carries that feeling into the final songs. And there is a different kind of performer, rarer, for whom the song is the thing that does not change, who gives the last song to one person the same way they would have given it to 500, because the song itself does not know the difference, and the person listening always does. Edith Piaf, on this particular night in a small Paris cabaret that no longer exists under any name anyone would remember, was the second kind. It was not a quality she had chosen. It was a quality she had arrived at through the specific education of the streets, which did not allow for much difference between a large audience and a small one, because the coins came the same way in either case, one by one, or not at all. What the street had given her was the knowledge that a single person paying full attention was not a diminished audience. It was the audience the song had always been written for.